right, good morning, everybody. I'm Jeff Edwards. This is Barnyards and Backyards Live. We're changing things up a little bit today. My co-host today is Donna Hoffman. She is an extension educator from Natrona County. Good morning, Donna. How are you?
Good morning. Glad to be here.
And our guest today is Mr. Brian Sabady. He's an extension educator from Laramie and Albany County. I'll get it out there eventually. I'll remember what county you're in. Good morning, Brian. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you, Jeff?
Good, excellent. Today we are talking about tomatoes. So it's all about Tomato Day. We might throw in a couple other tidbits here and there, but that is the plan. Before we actually jump into the program, I would like to remind everybody who is watching on Zoom, if they have questions, to please roll over the top of the Zoom tool, and at the bottom there will be a button. It's either the chat or the Q&A button, and click on those, type that information in, and we'll bring that question forward to Brian, or one of us will answer it. And if you're following us on Facebook, please enter your question in the chat or in the comments section on Facebook. And Jenny Thompson, who is also with us today, keeping things going for us, will bring those Facebook questions over to us, and we'll get them out to Brian as well. So thank you, Jenny, for keeping us going and keeping things straight. So I think, Brian, without further ado, if you would like to get us going, let's start talking about tomatoes.
Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, I'm excited to be here this morning. I feel like tomatoes is something that everyone likes to eat for the most part, something that everyone likes to grow. So it should be hopefully a fun hour that we get to talk about stuff here, and it should be one of those that should be pretty interactive. So yeah, I'll go ahead and share what I have here. I have a PowerPoint this morning.
Actually, as you're doing that, Brian, we have a comment already from Barb. Says tomatoes out in walls of water in Powell this week, 20 out and 20 more to go. So people are out there already getting their tomatoes in.
Getting them going. All right, perfect. Well, here in Laramie, like I said earlier, I'll wait till June 15th, which is our date. So I'm going to have to be patient. So there's some growing in the window here at the office, but yeah. Well, great. Well, yeah, to start us out, I thought I'd throw up a picture from a bunch of tomatoes I picked here in Laramie a couple years ago. This is kind of how they tend to look. So many of us have probably run into this issue here in Wyoming from time to time. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we can maybe help get these tomatoes growing a little bit faster. Ways to make sure they're healthy.
Have fewer green ones at the end?
We'll have a fewer, yes. Possibly. So we'll see what happens. So yeah,
Okay.
Here in Laramie, I don't think you can avoid that, but maybe yeah. Barb and Powell can. So, so yeah, I put on red lettering to make sure that we're ready to go for ripe tomatoes, right, Donna?
Yes. The sooner we get them in the sun, the better.
The better, yeah. So yeah, I've got a few slides. I think it's kind of interesting to think about that, you know, these plants are native to South America. They're also related to peppers and eggplants and potatoes. So that's kind of interesting. Some of us might even be familiar with the noxious weeds, some of the nightshades that we have around the state. They really didn't make it to Europe till the 1500s. And one of those first places was obviously Italy. And so from there, we're all familiar with the culinary industry there in Italy using tomatoes and whatnot. So a lot of selective breeding has happened in that part of the world once they were introduced. Some of the best records are from the late 1700s in the United States. One of those places would be Thomas Jefferson's garden there, where he did a lot of breeding, finding different varieties and different things like that. So it's pretty cool looking back at some of those records of some of the varieties that have been grown in the United States for quite a long time.
I've always been really curious, or for several years have been curious about what Italian culinary tastes were like prior to the tomato making it there.
Right.
What did they, well, and then, you know, they didn't have pasta until they interacted with the Orient. So Italian culinary was probably a lot different in the early 1500s.
Right. You didn't want to go over and visit until the 1600s, perhaps. Right?
There you go.
Okay.
Everybody's eating was drastically different then.
Right. Right.
So I did hear a little tidbit at one point in time. Did you know that they added basil to the tomatoes because they discovered that basil helped keep flies out of the kitchen? So there was a practical, besides tasty, reason for adding the basil to that.
Cool. Well, that's good to know. Well, yeah, I guess one of the reasons too that this plant did so well in places like Italy is it enjoys hot temperatures. So it's a warm season crop. I kind of have here a generalization of warm season crops, what they like. Some of them like it even hotter than that. As we all know, we'll have temperatures above 90 degrees and our tomatoes are doing just fine, really loving life. But we really like warm soils and warm air temperatures. So for some parts, like, here in Laramie, we have to wait quite a while to get that to happen. One of those ways we can get around that is through a greenhouse, high tunnel, low tunnel, something like that. Jeff has some great pictures of some tomatoes he planted yesterday. Is that correct, Jeff?
Oh no, they've been in the ground for, I think, 2 or 3 weeks.
2 or 3 weeks. Okay.
I just took the photo this morning.
Oh, okay. I gotcha. All right. So yeah, tomatoes are actually a fruit that we're eating. It's actually a berry. If you want to do something fun later, Donna, you can Google numbers of varieties of tomatoes around the world, and you're going to get all sorts of different numbers. So I think the point to this is there's a lot that are out there. There's probably new varieties that people are breeding right now. So it's one of those things that if there's not one that you really like, just be patient because something else will probably come around.
I thought you were going to suggest that I start counting the varieties.
Oh, well, no, I don't think that'd be a fun activity. So,
okay.
So yeah, here's kind of a nice picture. Basically, we can find different tomatoes, basically all colors of the rainbow for the most part. Ones on the right are almost black in color. Red is what we're probably the most familiar with, but then we can get orange, yellow, light yellow, and then even green. I think this top picture also is good. You can also look through here. Man, there's a wide variety of tomatoes that we can get as far as shapes go, right, Jeff?
Yep. Shape, sizes, utility, different uses, right?
Right. Yep. So yeah, some that are great for slicing, some that are great for just picking to eat fresh, some that people prefer for canning, other cooking purposes. There's a lot of stuff that's out there. We can have grape shapes to these large Mongo ones, that are 3 to 5 pounds or something like that. But there's a lot that's out there. I think it's becoming probably a little more popular with folks to kind of try and find unique colors and different varieties and things like that. So
those 3 to 5 pounders are the ones that you're trying to grow for the add a row competition, aren't you?
Yes, 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 exactly.
Hey, Brian, are you familiar with any kind of resources out there that tells which varieties are good for making pasta sauces, or which ones are good for freezing, which ones are better for dehydrating, those kinds of things?
I'm not, Donna. We probably should not associate my name with cooking and canning.
Okay.
Because people might end up sick if we start having me provide that information. So, I'm sure there's probably some good university resources that are out there. I'm trying to think even with UW Extension. I know our nutrition and food safety team would be a good resource for that. So they'd be good.
All right. So what's next?
So what's next? Looking at our temperatures, Jeff. This might be a bit depressing. So Barb up in Powell, she's probably has a better option than me down here in Laramie, and you're over here in this Goshen County neck of the woods, Jeff. Yeah. So it's also good there. So yeah, this is just a map from 1961 to 1990. Number of days above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. So as we talked about, tomatoes really like it warm. So depending on where you are at in the state, it might be fine to just throw them outside, or you may need to think about actually using something else to help protect them a little bit, get them along so those temperatures are where they should be.
Yeah, Kara over in Lincoln County also is in one of those higher elevations like you are, Brian, and she's ready to go, but has to wait, just like you do.
Yes, be patient. Yes. So yeah, this is another map I like to use, Jeff and Donna. Basically looking at the average number of frost-free days. So for our tomatoes, they don't enjoy cold temperatures, as we've hammered on. So we really need to think about, what can we get to grow in a short amount of time, depending on where we're at. Other places, maybe we have a really nice long growing season, which makes it a little bit more suitable for some crops like tomatoes. So I always like to look at this to compare it with the number of frost-free days and then what you can expect for hot temperatures during the summer. So that kind of brings us to this, cartoon that I always like to throw up, timing. I think about here in Laramie, am I too late? Am I too early? What's happening with when those things go out? So here's here in my office, we've got a tomato looking out at its friend, the snow, out in the parking lot. There are actually tomatoes that are growing on there. But I think it's really important to think ahead. It's really easy for me in a location like Laramie, or if I was in Afton, to really get excited, want to start planting some things, and probably do it a little too early. And then I end up with plants that get too large inside, or quite, outgrow pots or different things like that. So I think timing is important, thinking about, if I'm in one of these short growing places, Jeff, you've had yours in a high tunnel for a couple weeks now.
Yeah.
But if you were going to direct seed that outside, right, you just plant that seed outside, you'd probably have to go a little bit different. When would you think about doing that outside for where you live in county?
Potentially May 15th, May 20th.
Okay. So with season extension, you're able to get about a month earlier.
Yep.
Is that what
Yeah.
you expect?
Exactly. And probably would be the case anywhere in the state, using some type of protected covered structure about 30 days earlier than what they normally would.
Right. Okay. And yeah, the other thing I think is important is really looking at the days to maturity. So some tomatoes take a fairly significant long amount of time to actually mature. Whereas, if we do some of these, cherry type tomatoes that are fairly small, they usually don't take as long to actually mature. So thinking about what you have for a growing environment and then matching that plant to that environment is really important. Okay, Donna, seed catalogs, things we all love, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
One of the best parts of snow in the winter.
Yes, looking through seed catalogs.
One of the catalogs that showed up at our place this year, it was called Just Tomatoes. Have you guys seen that one?
No.
Totally tomatoes?
Oh, maybe that was it. Totally Tomatoes.
Yes.
I think I've seen that.
But it was just tomatoes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, yeah, that's one of those that you can probably find whatever you need when it's regarding tomatoes. So yeah, I think looking through some catalogs, figuring out what's going to work the best for you is really important. As we think about days for germination, right? That's how long it's going to take for that seed to germinate. And then days to maturity, that's usually when that plant's a couple inches tall. And then the number of days it's probably going to take from that stage to actually produce the first set of fruit that we can harvest. So depending on our growing environment, that number might be true. If you live in a place like Laramie where it's colder, I probably tend to add a little bit of time to that just because conditions are not always ideal. So how are we doing on questions, Jeff and Donna?
So
we've gotten a couple of comments.
Okay.
I've lost track now. Barb mentioned Oxheart tomatoes are underused. I don't know. I don't even know if I've ever heard of an Oxheart tomato.
I've heard of them. I've never grown them though. So
Brian?
Maybe I'm underutilizing them too.
I have not grown them either. So maybe we'll have to try those out.
And then we have Linda Kay is looking for a thick-walled slicing tomato. Any ideas?
I like the Cherokee purple myself. I don't know if it's thick-walled enough for what you're looking for, but I like that or Brandywine.
Is that one of the or both of those the heirloom type?
They are,
varieties?
yep.
Okay. And then Linda K is, can you show how to prune tomato plants?
Oh, we're going to get to that, Linda.
That's
You
what I
be
thought.
ready. Here we go.
Yep.
Yeah, here in a minute we will get to that.
One more variety that's good for the slicing tomato is a celebrity tomato. Master gardeners here in Casper really like that one.
Perfect. All right, we get caught up then?
Yep.
Okay.
I think we can go ahead.
All right, awesome. So yeah, you know, the other part is thinking about matching the size of the tomato for what you have for space. So Jeff, you've got a big high tunnel that you have at your house, right? So you
Yes.
have, well, how tall is that thing? Like 9 feet tall or something? Taller than that.
Yeah, it's probably 9 or 10 feet tall at the peak.
Okay. So you
Maybe
have
a little taller than that.
okay, so you have a little bit more space. I haven't convinced you to build one of those in my backyard here in Laramie yet, but so I go with a smaller version. So for me, it works really well to have some of these determinate varieties. We don't have a lot of the more, you know, bigger slicing type tomatoes that are generally the determinate varieties. Determinates generally are the pear shaped, the cherry shaped, a lot of the smaller type tomatoes. So they'll usually stop when they're about 4 to 5 feet tall. Some will maybe go a little bit taller than that, but that's usually where they top out. Indeterminate, they'll just continue to grow. So if you have a larger space, that's a good one to go with. If they're outside and you have a good environment for that, go with that. Determinate for the most part tend to be a little bit, you know, shorter lived, right? Once they reach that height, they kind of tend to peter out as far as production goes. Intermediates are going to live a little bit longer. You know, we need to make sure that there's lots of support. So we have some pictures to talk about that. And then talking about pruning, like Linda brought up, is also important.
So I had a guy here in Casper who came in and talked to me several times and over a course of several years. He had a tomato that lived 3 years. And he was talking about that he'd read that in lower latitudes that they do grow more than 1 year. But is it not perennial because of our location on the globe?
So it's basically not perennial because if it has a freeze that kills it, it's not going to come back from that same root system.
So tender perennial outdoors, but if we bring them indoors, they still can.
Yep, they can live longer. Yep, if we leave them outside to where they die off, they're not going to come back from that same root system.
Gotcha.
So, yep. So yeah, that's always. I think I'm glad you brought that up, Donna. It's always a little bit confusing on that. So, so at one point many years ago, I went through many different catalogs online, ones I had mailed to me, and put together common varieties that I found. Have I planted all of these, Donna? No. Will I ever get to it? Probably not. But these are a lot of the ones that I was able to find through different sources. So again, there's so many different ones that are out there. I'm sure some of us have tried these, haven't tried some of them, but there's a lot that are out there. My favorites for here in Laramie are some of these. I've had good success, but I'm willing to always try different ones and new things. So one that's done really well for me is this barred boar, which is a green and red striped tomato. It actually becomes big enough that I can slice it for things here in Laramie, which is great. It's basically kind of a semi-determinate, it's called, so it's not really going to continue to grow really tall, but gets a little bit taller, but is able to produce a little bit bigger tomato for me. So Lemon Boy is another one that has done all right for me as well here. And some of these other ones tend to be smaller ones, you know, cherry type tomatoes that don't get quite as large, maybe more of that plum size, but those are the ones I've used. You tried any of those, Jeff or Donna?
Sun Gold is one of Diane's favorites. So
one of mine too. That's awesome.
Yeah.
And we grow Lemon Boy.
Okay.
Is Bumblebee black and yellow?
It should be. No, I don't remember where I even got that one, but it kind of has some stripes to it. So,
Okay.
yeah. So for me here in Laramie, you know, season extension is really important. I generally try to plant my tomatoes in the back of my high or my low tunnels. So this is about 4.5 feet tall, probably 4 feet tall, something like that. So I usually try to go with something this size, and they can end up, you know, hopefully getting enough sunlight to where we can produce some stuff. And I leave this plastic on there part of the year to help protect them. So if you're in Torrington or other places, it probably gets warm enough. You don't need to worry about it a whole lot.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to talk about these, then Jeff's going to talk about what's behind his head. So for me, I like to use a low tunnel, and then inside the low tunnel, I like to use walls of water to help protect those tomatoes. So I always like to experiment with some outside of walls of water or some sort of protection, and then some that are inside of those. So, so for me, I know this is not a tomato, this is a pepper. But as if you joined early, you might have heard us discussing. I have a hard time getting, you know, my peppers to fruit properly or get very large if I don't use walls of water. So they're one of those that kind of just help get a start on things, help retain that moisture, help protect against the wind if they're outside, and just kind of get things growing. And Jeff, you have sailor caps, correct?
Correct. So we always struggled with the walls of water for, you know, we use them year after year after year, and occasionally the cells would rupture, and then they don't want to stand up. The things that are behind me, we call them sailor caps. They are produced locally in Goshen County, but they have a wire frame, and it's one large sack that you partially fill up with water and then drop it over the frame and then fill it up with water the rest of the way, and then manipulate the top so that there's only one layer of plastic, and then you slice it open, and it works the same. It's the same concept either way. So it just depends on what you choose to use. And Donna had mentioned that they make a tube that if your individual cells in your walls of water rupture, you can slide a tube down inside of that and repair them, correct?
Yeah, a wall of water patch.
Okay. Anyhow, different methods to insulate and maintain that temperature and try to keep things going a little bit longer.
As well as making them last more than just one season.
Yeah.
Yeah, we like that when they last a little bit longer. So perfect. All right, thanks for sharing. So growing tomatoes. So here's some good starters here in my office I took pictures of yesterday. Getting nice and leggy for some of them, so that'll be a little bit challenging a little bit later down the line, but one of those things we can get growing earlier inside. These will be transplanted, but for the most part, you know, with a lot of our crops, Jeff and Donna, you know, they like fertile soils, full sun, consistent water. I think is a really important thing with tomatoes. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about that, and then protection from the elements. I think the wind blew one day last year in Laramie. I'm waiting for your laugh.
Yeah, right.
Okay, that was my joke. So it did not blow just one day last year. So some protection for these plants is really important because we can end up with a lot of wind depending on where we're at in the state. And you know, some of these crops don't do quite as well with some of these wind events. We end up with hail or different things like that, it can definitely be a challenge. So, Jeff or Donna, I don't know if you've ever done this. Have you ever poured a high nitrogen fertilizer on a tomato plant?
I don't believe that I have.
No, I haven't either.
I did it on accident one time in a container plant. And
accidentally on purpose?
Accidentally on purpose. And it just shriveled up so bad. I thought, oh my gosh, what did I do? Was there herbicide in that thing or whatever else? So it's really important not to get too high of a nitrogen fertilizer for these tomato plants, unlike some of our other crops that really like the high nitrogen. So usually if you can go with a 1 to 1 to 1 ratio, that's great. You know, if it's a 60-04 mix, that's probably not great. The first number obviously being nitrogen, so phosphorus, and then potassium. So we want to be looking at this number probably as far as potassium for a lot of our tomatoes. If we're seeing some issues, usually that's one of the things that we're lacking. So, this is kind of also, Jeff and Donna, just a kind of estimate of rule of, how far apart we want to plant our tomatoes. For a lot of those bigger varieties, maybe 2 to 3 feet apart. A lot of our smaller varieties, maybe it's 12 to 24 inches, but depending on what we do for pruning, what kind of containers or cages we have, we're going to talk about cages here in a minute. We may mix that up a little bit. So how far apart do you plant yours, Jeff?
Give me a second. They're about 3 feet apart.
Are they? Okay.
Yeah. I have Brussels sprouts planted in between them this year.
Oh, okay. Perfect.
And we grow ours in containers. They were feed supplement containers to start with, and that's what we put ours in. And we can put a tomato cage in the middle and the wall of water. And sometimes we can get another crop like Jeff's talking about, that like the Brussels sprouts, but that's too big for the container we're using. But anyway, we can put something else around the outside edge.
Okay. Great.
On the nutrients, I had recently heard that potassium is something that helps with disease resistance and for other things for cold hardiness. So with perennial things, it helps with cold hardiness, but the most important here with the tomatoes is the disease resistance. And then kind of an important thing for people with the tomatoes, the middle number, that phosphorus, is important for root growth as well as flower production. So things that we want fruit on, we want some of that phosphorus so that it'll set flower, which then of course leads to the fruits we want.
And I've heard that tomatoes are phosphorus hogs. They'll basically consume anything that you give them, correct?
I don't know if they're hogs, but yeah, I feel like yeah, they tend to use quite a bit. So
okay.
I think we can start using that as a scientific term, maybe, Jeff. So
phosphorus hogs.
Phosphorus hogs, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, I think those are all good points. Yeah. So Jeff and Donna, do you ever do this? I do, but I'm just curious what you do. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
You mean trench them?
Trench them, yes.
Usually not. I just dig a deep enough hole and drop them in as far as I can.
Okay. Okay. So kind of the same concept. You just go straight down.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, this is a strategy I like to try and use. It seems to help out a little bit with getting a better stem, a little bit better strength with tomatoes. So it's one of those that you don't have to use it, but it tends to help it out a little bit. And it just is always so cool to me that you can do this with a tomato and it sets new roots. And so to me, it's kind of a cool plant that you can do this with.
It's really interesting looking at those exposed stems that develop roots on them. They kind of look alien if you don't realize what those are that are growing on a stem, especially in high humidity setting, but definitely beneficial for the plant to draw up nutrients and water if they're underground.
Right. Yep. So here's a couple examples, Jeff and Donna. We've got a seedling that started here that's really starting to get leggy. Basically, it's reaching for light, so it's not putting a lot of energy into its stem. Another one that was directly planted into a pot here. If we wanted to, we probably would try to fill up some more of this container with soil a little bit later on to try and fill in some of this so it could be a little bit deeper in that pot and try and raise that soil above these first leaves that we have here, so we could hopefully try and strengthen that. So I'll keep doing these leggy plants and demonstrations in my office for you, Donna. So
well, at least it looks like that day you didn't have snow in the parking lot.
There's not snow that day. There might be piles somewhere, but not that day.
Hey, Donna, I'm trying to understand, and maybe Jenny can help. I'm trying to understand Linda Kay's question. So May 20th in the unheated greenhouse, And then
She had a question about when to transplant them out. So she does an unheated greenhouse.
oh, so she's asking when to start them in the unheated greenhouse and then move them outside after they've after they're
I
large enough
think
to
it might be
transplant?
planting in the so like if it was a hoop house or something, when would you plant out to it? I believe is the question. If it's not, she can write back to us. Such as you have done in yours.
Oh, such as I have done. So me personally, I rely on someone else starting my tomato plants, like the local greenhouse. And usually I'm not very picky at what I'm trying to grow variety wise. So they'll be 3 or 4 inches tall. And then if I remember correctly, we actually planted them on the 1st of April inside the sailor caps. And, you know, it depends on your environment, where you're at. Just
So
kind of
Red,
figure.
Red Desert is west of Rollins, and I know Rollins is over 6,000 feet of elevation. Jeff, you're between 4 and 5.
42 or
42.
4,200.
So you may be able to get them out in the unheated greenhouse by May 20th, but if you have a cold snap where we get below freezing, you might have to do some of those protective measures around individual plants, like the walls of water, or putting a gallon of water next to the plants that will hold heat and radiate it in an unheated greenhouse overnight.
But if you're planting them, I would think that if you're planting them into a high tunnel, you have plants started like I have, planting them into a high tunnel, you should be able to get away with by the 1st of May, as long as you put some type of wall of water or something around them. It's one of those things to experiment with.
Yeah, and it really is. Every year is different, and who knows, like, I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, we had snow on June 6th. Of course, all the plants were in the garden by then, so you just
Sure.
protect them as well as you can and hope for the best the next morning.
Yep. Okay, Brian, please continue.
All right, I'll keep moving on. So pruning. Basically with this, we're looking to remove a little bit of extra vegetative material. So hopefully plants are putting more energy into their fruit production and not so much into unneeded vegetative production. So it can help with air circulation. You know, depending on where we do it or when we do it, it can be beneficial for the plant. If we do it too late in the year, sometimes it might be not as beneficial. So it's one of those, play around with what you're comfortable with. But for the most part, with the determinate, we're going to prune up to that first set of fruit. And then for the indeterminate varieties, we'll just continue to prune some of those suckers as they get taller.
So Brian, for determinate varieties, are you you're actually waiting until the first set of blossoms show up and then you're pruning out everything else? Tell me a little more about how you're pruning them.
Yeah, so if this is my stem, as
Yep.
it continues up, I would keep pruning these suckers out until I got to that first cluster of fruit or flowers. So for the most part, you know, if this is at the beginning of the plant, right? So if it's these, I know it's going to be a little bit before I get my first fruit cluster. So I'm probably going to prune out some of these. But generally, for the most part, Jeff, as soon as we start to get very big suckers, we're probably going to see where that fruit cluster is starting to form. So I'm
Okay,
have my mouse up here. It would be up here probably somewhere, maybe a little bit taller.
So basically, any point that there's a growth occurring between the leaf and the main stem,
In the axle.
you want to take that out.
Yep.
Up to the point where you start to see the flowers.
Yep.
Okay. On any branches, or is there just one branch in the determinant, or is there could there be multiple branches that you're doing this with?
Oh, there'll be multiple branches. So
Okay.
you know, you'd be doing this all the way up till you get to that first cluster.
Okay.
So some folks may want to go more than that, but that's just kind of the rule of thumb that's thrown out there for how to do that. So some people like to prune them differently to fit better shapes of where they're at, but That's kind of the general rule of thumb.
Okay.
So Jeff, there is a question about the
Sailor caps?
sailor's caps. A website on where they can find them online says they are not able to shop in Goshen County.
Let me do a little research. I'll see if I can find them for you. Go ahead, Brian.
Sounds good. Okay. So yeah, we're just looking to get those out, prune to what's going to work the best for you. The other thing is thinking about disinfecting your hands, disinfecting any tools you might be using to clip those out. So we're not spreading potential viruses between plants. So it's a lot like pruning of fruit trees, for example. We just want to make sure that things are staying clean.
So Christina has a question about planting the plants deeper to get the roots on the stems, especially if they've gone leggy. So she asks, do you think the plants remember that distance their stem when they get leggy? Like they go stem, 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 leaves, and remember that the distance even after they get good light. What's the science behind that? I hope that made sense.
Plants don't remember.
Yeah, so they'll just, they have a specific growth pattern that they have. So no matter how deep you plant them, they're going to end up with that same pattern for their stems and their leaves. So it doesn't matter a whole lot as far as if you plant it too deep, they're going to continue growing in that same pattern. So
the legginess is pretty much driven by how intense the sunlight is. If they're getting enough sunlight, they won't be very leggy. There won't be a big distance between the one set of leaves and then the next set of leaves. And if they do kind of stretch out and you bury that when you transplant it, then the next kind of internode in between this set of leaves will be driven by how much sunlight it has at that point when it's growing. So it doesn't, just because it gets leggy once doesn't mean it'll continue to be leggy the entire time it's growing.
Right. Yeah. Once it's exposed to plenty of sunlight, the internodes shorten up. Or they don't grow as long.
Right. Okay. Now I got you. Yeah. Well, it's all a matter of, being driven by light. So. Okay. So this is meant to be confusing. There's a lot of things going on here because if you do an internet search for how to help support your tomatoes, even though we might plant them deeper and get a good stem, for the most part, we probably are going to need some sort of support if we want them to grow more vertically than horizontally. So sometimes I will use cages, sometimes I won't. But generally I try to use some sort of cage or something, even a stick I put in the ground and then some clips to help some of my plants. For a lot of our determinate varieties, these work great because they're only going to get so tall and then these help support them. For our indeterminate varieties, so if we're in a larger space outside or in a high tunnel, there's different things like this with either twine or rope that we can attach those plants to that and continue to grow. So here would be kind of what we're looking at for somebody's backyard where they've done the twine. They can grow up that twine for a ways. If we need to, we can actually extend these out so it actually lengthens the rope, and we can actually get longer plants to continue to grow that way. So one of those that you can find all sorts of different things out there, but just figure out what's going to work the best for your garden.
So I've actually been in a research greenhouse where they're growing consistently for quite a number of months, and that the next slide that you have the little spool with the string on it, they've attached the vine to that, but as the vine continues to grow, they let the spool out and then they let the stem coil at the ground level so that they can keep the flowers in production and climbing, even though the roof is a determinate height and the plant can't grow beyond the roof of the building or the greenhouse.
Yep.
So yeah, you can make plants think that they're still climbing even though they're not getting any taller away from the surface of the earth.
Right. So you let wire out and then move it down this way. Yep. So, yep, for sure. So yeah, how are we doing on questions so far?
Miriam mentions that she puts her tomatoes out in her unheated greenhouse in April. And
there was a question on Facebook, I think, if anybody, they were asking if anybody uses the line method like you're showing here, Brian. This is how I grow my indeterminate tomatoes. So yeah, I prune them down to 1 main leader, I guess is what you would call it. And then as they grow up, I drop twine down and lower the plant down and kind of basically keep the fruiting production area at the same height. So yeah, that's how we do it.
Okay, cool. So yeah, so that's where we're at as far as taking care of tomatoes. We have a quick video as far as what to do with green tomatoes or things that you end up with at the end of the season here in Wyoming, because somehow we end up with that. So let me see if I can share my screen here. You can see the screen, Jeff?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Hear it?
Yep.
At the end of the growing season, you usually end up with a bunch of green tomatoes. You end up with these green tomatoes because A, it's going to snow, or B, we're going to have a really long frost period in Wyoming. The question is, what do we do with these green tomatoes? Do we cut them up and make fried green tomatoes, or is there a different way that we can actually get them to ripen in our houses? Another option we have is to actually use another fruit, like a banana, which releases ethylene. The ethylene will actually help ripen the tomatoes as well. Our third option is to pack all of the tomatoes into a box, usually wrap them in newspaper. This way they're protected, and leave them in a dark place that's also cool until they are ready to be eaten. Another thing to consider is making sure that all of your tomatoes are healthy when you put them into the box. You want to avoid damages and blemishes like this. That way you don't end up with rot in the entire box, which can spread to other tomatoes. Think about what type of tomatoes you have. This tomato, for example, is actually ripe. It may not look ripe as compared to your general red tomato, but it's ready for fresh eating. From the University of Wyoming Extension, I'm Brian.
Okay, so there's kind of a quick video, a little bit of a plug for a video series that Donna and I partake in. So you have other gardening questions outside of tomatoes, you can look up From the Ground Up and check out some things. So, so there's a quick overview of what to do with some of those green tomatoes. I think that was the bumblebee there, Jeff, that I was showing. That was kind of more of that pink color with the damage on it. So. So yeah, the other thing that always comes up, I feel like, is saving seeds. There's a wide variety of ways to do this. I know one of our former specialists, he likes to just kind of put them on a paper towel and replant that paper towel the following year, and the paper towel breaks down, and he goes along with it that way. For me, I tend to put seeds in kind of a strainer and spray them off and kind of clean them up that way. It's not perfect, but it works. The other way, I don't know if you, Donna or Jeff, ever do this. I've done it once or twice, is put seeds in a container and then basically let them sit there. They ferment, and then the seeds will kind of drop down, right? I don't know that I've always done it the best, but it kind of helps to clean things up, because basically you end up with a lot of material that ends up with your seeds, which makes it really tough if you try to like have individual nice clean seeds. So have you tried any of those?
I'm not a seed saver, so no, I have not.
Okay.
And I have tried the fermenting method. It ended up being a slimy mess, and so I'm kind of stuck with the idea, like Jeff is, I'll buy my seeds. I'm not sure what both parentages are on varieties anyway, so I'm probably not saving true to variety if I save seed anyway.
Okay, perfect. Okay, well, we may as well talk about all the things that are going to go wrong now, right?
Tomatoes have issues.
They do have issues
Just
sometimes.
people.
Yeah. So yes, since we don't live in Illinois or Iowa or someplace like that, Missouri, where it's probably really great for growing tomatoes, we do have some issues that pop up from time to time. Some of these might be from the environment, and sometimes some of these might be from insects or disease. So we're going to go through just some of the things that happen. I feel like, I don't know if you feel this way, Jeff and Donna, the longer you're around extension and dealing with tomatoes, you probably find something new that can go wrong with these things. So it's one of those of, there's pretty big manuals on this. So I've kind of just covered some of the highlights of things that can happen, you know, here in Wyoming that I've particularly come into contact with. So one of the main things is making sure that tomatoes have plenty of water. You know, if we look at a lot of our soils, if we're not using a potting soil, generally they tend to be fairly low in organic matter. So organic matter helps with holding more water in a soil. And depending on what the type of soil we have, it might be able to hold a lot of water or not very much. So for the most part in Wyoming, we can tend to be on this sandier side. The nice thing about sandy soils is, as you know, Jeff and Donna, you can get water into them really fast, right?
Yep.
So you're there in Goshen County, Jeff, there's pretty sandy soil, so you can put water down. It goes into the ground really fast, but the challenge is it can't hold a lot of that water. As we start going towards clay soils, they can hold a lot of water, but sometimes it's not always as available to plants. So what we're really looking at is trying to make sure our soil is in this sweet zone. So we don't want plants where there's so little water that they're wilting, but we want to make sure that they have enough that they can continue to grow. And if there's some hot temperatures, they've got plenty of water to keep doing their thing. So the point to this is, if you have sandy soils, think about watering a little more often. If you have clay soils, maybe not quite as much.
Perfect.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Sure.
All right. Try not to get too nerdy on the soil side of things.
Don't geek out on us.
Yeah, keep talking about tomatoes. Okay. So here's some tomatoes that we're having a little bit of issues with, just some leaves kind of rolling up. It wasn't necessarily from insects, but more from too much light at times. And so, you know, Jeff, you always are kind of the man to know what types of shade cloth to use for high tunnels and things like that. This isn't a high tunnel. But for some of these plants, you know, if they're in a high tunnel or greenhouse, Jeff, as you very well know, they can get light from different directions, and you get light going underneath the leaves. And so, you know, they'll tend to roll up like this. They don't ever unroll, I guess. But, you know, as far as production, they seem to still be okay. But yeah, that shade cloth helps. So
yeah, so if folks are interested in this who are producing in high tunnels and they see this type of problem, shade cloth, a 30% shade cloth will help those leaves open up and allow the plant to be more energy efficient, I guess, be able to photosynthesize like they should. So just a cover over the top of your high tunnel will eliminate a lot of this leaf rolling, and your plant should be a little more productive.
okay, perfect. All right, another one, herbicide damage. So this is one of those that happens even though we don't anticipate it happening. Lots of times this happens from either an accidental application somewhere or some accidental drift. Sometimes we can end up with some issues where we get some manure that's been contaminated with herbicide that's then been used for growing vegetables. So these are some examples of, unfortunately, some tomatoes that came into a little bit of contact. You know, if you replant them, lots of times they can come out of it. But depending on what you have, sometimes you may just have to start over. So unfortunately, I wish this did not happen, or we did not see this, but this is one of those things that comes along.
This is one of those things that where you really need to know your source of compost. You know, if it's your own and you know that it's clean, that you haven't used any herbicides or anything like that, great. But if you are using compost from a public source, you might not know what's in it, and these types of things show up.
And you can
I-
test it. There's a bioassay that one of our folks talk about where you can just plant some beans and take some compost, put it in a pot, plant some beans, and then you look for damage. And that can save you some problems.
Yeah, one year I tried planting potatoes where you grow them in straw. And I purchased the straw at the local feed store. Sure, they were thinking it was going to be bedding when they sold it, but anyway, there was herbicide on it, and I
Yep.
managed to kill all my potatoes in the process.
Yep, it happens. So go
Yeah.
ahead, Brian.
Yeah, and I think the other part too is, we generally don't recommend using animal manure for using with our vegetable garden. And so that's also another source where if they've been eating hay that's been sprayed with a herbicide, they'll ingest that feed and then it actually comes out the back end and then we end up with issues that way. So, yeah, always one of those things to try and make sure you know exactly where it comes from. All right, cracks or blemishes. I know none of us here have ever had this happen, right?
No.
No,
Everything's
no.
perfect all the
Everything's
time.
perfect every time. Yep, you could sell it in the market, not a problem. So, there's a wide variety of reasons that these things happen. It might be too much sunlight. Maybe Jeff has something in a container, or Donna, or me. It's been in that spot and it got too big, and it's like, well, darn it, I need to move it so I can get into my garage now or something, right? So that ends up being, we turn it around, fruit ends up getting a lot of sunlight on it. We can have issues that way. Sometimes if things have dried out, they're actively growing and then we water those plants a lot. Sometimes they grow so fast that we have cracks that way. We can have damage from wind or hail where it bumps into something. Temperature extremes can also do this, where if it's been really cold or really hot, that can also happen. So, and then again, with that rapid growth, if we've not been taking good care of things and then they all of a sudden snap out of it, we can have those issues. Another one we tend to see is blossom end rot. This really goes back to that information about the soils, having consistent soil moisture. That helps with the cracks on top, make sure things are consistently growing at the same rate. This tends to happen lots of times when we have inconsistent watering, and we end up with kind of a calcium deficiency that ends up with leaving these bad blemishes on the ends. So
even though this is called a rot, it's not a disease.
Right. So yeah. This is more of a watering issue than necessarily a nutrient issue. So Jeff and Donna, you probably have seen a lot of this over the years, I'm guessing.
Yeah, and I've heard it called vacationer's disease. Again, a little misnomer because it's a disease, but basically if somebody goes on vacation or is gone a long time and maybe even asked to have someone help do the watering for them, the watering wasn't done consistently, and in our soils and in our water, there's plenty of calcium there, but it's not available to the plant if there's not water to take it up.
Yeah. Yep. So yeah, that's a good name for it. I might start using that Donna. So yeah, this is kind of a chart going back to soils a little bit that talks about, with a lot of our soils that are, depending on the pH. Oh, what's that, Donna?
Keep going.
Keep
She's
going.
having a side conversation. Go ahead, Brian.
Sorry. So yeah, no, depending on our pH of our soils, we can have nutrients that are really available or nutrients that are not quite as available. So this goes into our tomato conversation, but it also goes into a lot of our other vegetables that we grow. So I think it's important that we put this up here. I don't know, folks here, if you're using a native soil you've amended, maybe it's just potting soil, but I think it's important to remember these things because lots of times we can end up with really weird things that happen. Here's a iron deficient strawberry plant in Laramie, a cucumber that was deficient in nitrogen, so it couldn't grow properly and kind of just ended up being stunted.
And turned into a fig.
Turned into a fig, exactly. So, we talked a lot about potassium and other things earlier. So I just mention it because, Jeff and Donna, I feel like sometimes we forget about these things, these micro and macronutrients that plants need. So really important. All right, sun scald. The sun is never bright here at high elevations, so I never have to worry about this. Okay, I'm saying that sarcastically. This can happen again if we move a plant. Lots of times my container plants, or I've been on vacation, I go, oh, shoot, Jeff, I needed to prune this thing like 2 weeks ago, and then I prune that plant and then a bunch of fruit is exposed to a bunch of sunlight. I'll end up with this issue lots of times.
Yep.
You know, just something that's fairly common. Another one is yellow shoulder. I've had this quite a few times. See, this is why you probably selected me, because you're like, he's had so many issues over the years with his tomatoes. He'll know exactly what's going on.
Brian, that's called experience.
Experience. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Every year is different, no matter what you're growing. You're going to learn something, and that's the thing about gardening is every year is different, and there's a new lesson to be learned or a new pest to be dealt with.
Right. Yep.
The interesting thing is all of these conditions, these are still edible fruit. I would carve off the sun scald stuff, but there's still portions of them that you can eat.
Right.
Salsa.
Yes.
Salsa, yes. So with this one, I think this is probably pretty important, right? High pH, high salts, low organic matter. Does that sound like any Wyoming soils to you?
Yeah, all of them.
All of them,
yeah.
right? Yeah. So can also be from a lack of potassium. We have really hot temperatures that can add to that as well. But just one of those, if you might have these issues, maybe a soil test at the beginning of the year to figure out what you have going on could be really important to help you out.
There's been some conversations going on in Facebook that are seed saving related, and then other things too. But Linda Kay is asking about companion plants, and her comment is apparently Brussels sprouts. Well, in my instance, it's Brussels sprouts because that was the only space left in the high tunnel. So I can't tell you if Brussels sprouts are a companion plant to tomatoes. Donna, do you either of you guys know about companion plants for tomatoes?
I do not know for sure. I have printed off lots of lists for people to use as a reference, but it's not something that's stuck in my memory bank.
Yeah, I'm having to think back to the list we always have for master gardeners. So
apparently basil.
Basil, yeah, there you go. For me, honestly, I just try to kind of have mine. I'm not usually looking for beans or peas or other things like that. As far as nitrogen fixers for my tomatoes, I usually keep those a little bit separate. So for the most part, I would try to avoid anything that's really going to compete with it, or what tomatoes are going to compete with other crops. So, a lot of our low growing crops like our beets and things like that, carrots, sometimes they get shaded out by the tomatoes. So,
yeah.
So I've pulled up a chart from online. Of course, it's probably not comprehensive, but friends of tomatoes are asparagus, carrots, celery, onion, parsley, and peppers. And enemies of tomato are corn, dill, kohlrabi, and potatoes.
So cole crops, kohlrabi.
Well, kohlrabi, but yeah, it doesn't list other cole crops.
It's an experiment this year. We're going to see what happens.
Right.
Perfect.
So Brian, go ahead.
All right, I'll keep going here. So blights. These are some other things that we tend to have show up. Basically, when we have water that gets on leaves, we've got really dense canopies on these plants, and we can end up with some of these issues where this is more of a disease issue, not like the rot, but that's what it looks like, and we end up with issues on the leaves. If it gets really bad, sometimes we just have to basically remove those plants and then start over.
Yeah.
So yeah. Fusarium and Verticillium wilt. Did I do okay?
Yeah, you got them.
Yeah, we did okay again. All right. So these are some fungal issues. Again, I've seen this a few times pop up. Again, sometimes they tend to happen in high tunnel situations. If it's really humid all the time is where I've run into it. Doesn't really get very warm sometimes as well. It seems to be kind of those really humid, colder environments. Can happen in hot environments as well, but you know, if we have these sorts of issues, we probably just need to remove those plants. You know, we can select some plants that tend to be resistant to some of these diseases. So if you're having disease issues or worried about it, you can dive in a little bit and try to find some varieties that are a little more resistant. So again, one of those, we probably just want to remove that and get rid of that leaf material so it's not in our area. So these are some plants that's not a wilt. This is more of an environment situation of some plants that were pretty growing nicely in a greenhouse, and then were moved to a different location where the temperature ended up being cooler, not quite as much light. And so this is more of a stress from the environment and not so much a major disease issue. So tomatoes sometimes can be pretty finicky. So depending on what changes occur with where they're at, we can end up with some different looks and some not so healthy plants. All right, Jeff, it's your favorite time. We're talking about insects.
Okay, before we get there though, Barb has mentioned that tomato spotted wilt is her enemy. She's verified that she has thrips and white flies. So she ends up pulling about half of her plants every year. She's tried sticky traps, spinosad and neem oil. And sorry, Barb, but basically that is your tool available to you. Thrips are probably one of the worst ones to try to control, including white flies. That's probably number 2. But just keep after it, do your best. So Brian, if you want to talk about the rest of these, go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry, Barb.
Yeah.
So yeah, you know, spider mites, you know, Donna, I had these on those potatoes in the container this year, but somehow they didn't make it to the tomatoes. So, but you know, these can be an issue. Sometimes we'll see the webbing that happens with this. Lots of times we can actually just spray them off with some, you know, a stream from the hose, which is nice. We can end up with aphids as an issue. So there again, your neem oil will hopefully help take care of that.
There's also
again,
there's a aphid specific fungus that you can use that you can buy commercially.
Oh, okay. Perfect.
I think Bariva bassiana, I think. Let me look it up. Hold on.
Okay. I'll let you look at that. I just wanted to also mention, you know, really scouting out and making sure you're looking for these things is important throughout the year. Because if you have the vacationer's disease, that's what I'm going to call all of my stuff now, Donna.
Oh, good.
Yeah, you can end up with these things popping up and, you know, not paying attention, and then they're there. So
Fisherman's vegetable gardening.
yes, that's what it is. Tomato hornworms, they're another issue as well. I'm sure most of us have probably seen these things pop up. They can eat a fair amount of leaf material, so depending on how many are there, they might be an issue. If it's just a few, it's maybe not a huge deal, but another one of those that we tend to see quite a bit. There are some parasitic wasps, I believe, Jeff, that will take these guys out, which is pretty crazy. You can see these little white things on top of them where they're
the white things are actually the pupa. So the larva has emerged from the insect already, and it's the pupal cases that are hanging out.
Okay. Psyllids, I will not say Psyllids to make Jeff angry this morning. We're going to go with Psyllids. These are another one that we can end up with as well. Here's what they look like. There's the nymph stage up here, and then we've got the adults here. You know, if we get these in a greenhouse situation, again, that's pretty tough because they're kind of just in there all the time, but really important to monitor for those as well. This is a little grainy, but thrips are going to look somewhat similar to some of the spider mite damage. The other thing that can be challenging is I believe they can transfer some diseases, some viruses from plant to plant. So these things make it a little challenging for what we have. So, you know, with a lot of these disease or with these insect issues, you know, doing that monitoring, trying to do some early control is probably your best bet to keep these things out.
Yeah, thrips and white flies are terrible on tomatoes, and they are very difficult to control.
Yeah, and you probably have dealt with that in your own high tunnel, I'm guessing, huh, Jeff?
Fortunately not. Nothing.
Okay.
No significant pests on tomatoes, but we do have the biggest thing that we deal with are spider mites in raspberries.
Okay.
And right now I've got a little bit of a grasshopper problem going on in my high tunnel. I'm going to have to take care of.
Okay. Chicken.
Yeah.
Chicken.
All right. Well, I know we're just out of time here, but some other resources I wanted to put up. There's a great article from Bill Stump, who's our plant pathologist at the University of Wyoming and the College of Ag. He has a great article about diseases with tomatoes, which can be found on the Barnyards and Backyards website. Iowa State has some great videos as far as pruning, different things like that, growing tomatoes, which are nice. And then as always, at our website, we have, sections on growing vegetables, soils questions, insect control, those types of things can all be found there as well. So yeah, do we have any other final follow-up questions here, Jeff, that
I'm not seeing any. Beauveria bassiana is the fungal pathogen, and I've typed that into the chat for folks who are interested in that.
Okay.
Maybe Jenny can transfer that over to Facebook. I think that we've hit a lot of the questions. I think that's it.
Okay. Well, I appreciate those that have hung out with us for the hour this morning, and I hope everyone has a great garden this year, and hopefully it's always great conditions, no hail, no wind, and all those sorts of things that we need. So
yeah, thanks, Brian. And I'd like to remind everybody this is our last show of the 2021 spring season, I guess. So we may be doing this again in the fall, but once weather gets nice and people are wanting to go outside and do things, it's hard to have a captive audience. So we're going to take a little bit of a break.
Brian, do you want to unshare so we can see your wonderful faces a little better?
I will do that. How's that?
Perfect.
Great.
Okay.
So to wrap up the program today, Jenny is sharing other resources, and this one is particularly out on the UW Extension website, and you can go out and specifically look for things like vegetable resources, more on tomatoes, those types of things. But all of our other programs are listed out there along with all the references that go with them. If you have questions about previous programming, they're all listed out there as well, and you can watch the previous programs. And then as we get closer into the fall, we'll be talking about and setting up a schedule for our fall programs too. If you have questions to ask of people from UW Extension, you can go to the search in the internet and find the UW Extension websites. We have an office in every county, and phone numbers there. You can call folks and ask them your questions. And I think that's probably it. Did we miss anything, Jenny?
I think you got it all.
Okay. All right. So thank you both. Thank you, Donna, for being co-host today. Yeah. And Jeremiah. Jeremiah is not with us today.
Speaking about in the sunshine.
Yeah, being out in the sunshine. Brian, thanks for all the good information on tomatoes as well. And everybody for participating. Thank you very much. If you have, if you'd like to give us input, Jenny has posted out there. There's a survey that you can fill out. And we do look at those when they are filled out and completed, and take into account what you are asking for, and we try to get those topics covered. So please take the opportunity and fill those out when you can. Thanks, everybody. Enjoyed this season. Look forward to hosting it again in the fall, and stay in touch. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Donna and Brian. Thank you for everybody who joined us. Bye-bye.